They've lived in the ocean for over 500 million years. Marvels of evolution, they are as beautiful as they are venomous. Yet they pose little threat to humans. Until now. From Paul E Cooley, author of The Black, the Medusa Zone will make you fear the ocean. Available now from Amazon.com. Hello, Fiendlings. How the hell are you? I began podcasting this novel for you nearly 30 weeks ago. Granted, it was Joe Hempel doing the heavy lifting, but this has been a long journey, and another is about to begin. Before I start this episode, I do want to say a couple of things. I want to thank Fireside Audio and Joe Hempel for doing such an outstanding job on all the Black 2nd edition audiobooks. I couldn't have done it better myself, which is sad, considering the next bit. Next week, the first episode of The Black Evolution, Book 4 in the Black series, will drop. Due to logistical issues, Joe was unavailable to record the last 3 books in the series. Therefore, you're stuck with me. That's right. I'll be narrating the last 3 Black books for you, so get ready for terrible female voices, erratic pronunciations, and the occasional gaffe. I'll do my best, as always, but know that my voice ain't what it used to be. Regardless, you'll be getting the story, and I think that's all that matters. If you enjoyed this novel, please consider purchasing the audiobook from any major retailer or the ebook and trade paperback from Amazon.com. Got a KDP Unlimited account? Check out any of my other available novels and begin reading. Every page read helps, every sale helps, every listener matters. Speaking of book sales, I have a new novel out called The Medusa Zone, published by Raventail Publishing. If you enjoy deep-sea thrillers with rather unique creatures, this is one you definitely want to check out. I'll leave a link in the show notes. With that, I'm going to get out of the way and let you get to the narration. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 30, the finale of The Black, Outbreak.
Chapter 65. The world was a place of pain and smoke. His lungs burned, and so did his skin. The jumpsuit had protected him from the worst of the heat, but it hadn't been designed for extreme temperatures. He knew one suit leg had melted, which accounted for the searing pain up and down the backside of his calf and thigh, but the burns weren't the worst of it. It was the broken ribs making it difficult to breathe. He still wasn't sure what he'd seen. When Harold first blasted the thing with the taser, blue arcs of electricity had danced off the creature's carapace. The thing had shaken as though it was being electrocuted, but it had recovered, and then it started going after Harold through the doorway. He'd screamed for her to hit it again, but seconds had passed without anything happening. Just as he was getting ready to yell at her, ask her what the fuck she was doing in there, the arcs of electricity started again. Only this time they looked like lightning bolts. The creature's carapace had started to disintegrate, large flakes exploding off and turning into dust. Some part of Mathis's mind had told him to get behind the wall. He'd listened to it. It was the only thing that had saved him. An instant later, a gout of fire and debris had flown past the wall. His right leg hadn't been completely behind cover, and the force knocked him sideways as well as burned his suit. When he'd hit the concrete floor, something snapped in his chest, or rather several things. If he had any intact ribs left, he'd be surprised. He felt the urge to cough from both the smoke and his aching lungs. "Better not," he told himself. "He may have punctured a goddamn lung." What he should do is stay right here on the floor and wait for help. But as that bitch Moore had made very clear, no help was coming until they rid the building of all the creatures. Speaking of, Mathis held his chest as tightly as he could and tried to sit up. The tsunami of pain forced a muted scream from his mouth. Christ, but that hurt. He tried again and managed to get upright. He breathed through his mouth in shallow gasps and finally struggled to his feet. The world tilted, and he nearly lost his balance. He felt moisture on one side of his face. Mathis raised a hand and gently touched at his right ear. The hand came away bloody. "Busted my goddamn eardrum," he said aloud. From around the corner, something scraped against the floor. At first he thought it was more phantom noise from his damaged ears, but the sound continued. It wasn't rhythmic or continuous, but more of a staccato scraping followed by seconds of silence. He took a deep breath and immediately regretted it as a lightning bolt of pain drove the air from his lungs and whistled through his mouth. Yep, that was a good sign of a punctured lung. He kept his arms tight around his chest and staggered slowly to the corner. If the thing was still alive, he was dead anyway. He couldn't run, couldn't hide, and there was no goddamn place to go, but he wanted to see. Had to see. The scraping sound continued as he reached the corner, and then it stopped. He paused for a second, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. He was too tired to feel much of anything other than pain and the unreal disconnectedness of shock. He sipped a breath, groaned, and stepped past the corner. The sight of the floor made him forget all about the pain. When he and Harold had originally reached the security office, the concrete floor outside the reinforced steel room had been clean and blemish-free. A 3-meter ragged swath of concrete had disappeared. Bent rebar jutted from the hole like broken ribs. Pulverized concrete dust covered everything, including the walls. The ceiling was a wreck of blasted tiles, wiring, and metal. The explosion had savaged the ductwork, twisting the relatively thin aluminum into incomprehensible shapes. Only one emergency light remained lit. The others had been completely destroyed by the explosion. But the real shock was the security door. The heavy-plated steel was warped inward on one side and no longer fit in the frame. He blinked at it and then realized it was partway open. He nearly jumped when gloved fingers appeared through the gap and the door scraped open again. "Harold? Mathis? You're alive?" He limped to the door, placed a hand on the warped side, and pulled. The door scraped against the concrete and moved another centimeter. He tried to pull harder, but the spectacular lightning bolt of pain through his chest stopped him. He stumbled backward, moaning. "Mathis, what's happening?" He turned, put his back to the wall, and leaned against it. "I'm broken inside," he said. A curl of blood streamed down his lips. "I can't move the door." Harold sobbed on the other side of the door. "Is it gone? Tell me it's gone." In spite of the pain, he grinned. "We got it. We got it." "Good," she said. He barely heard her voice, but she started yelling into the radio. "More, we killed it, but we need help, now." Mathis didn't hear the response. He slowly slid down the wall, whimpering in pain. He blinked once, twice, and then his eyes closed, and the darkness had him. Chapter 66. The dark had never been Sarah's favorite. As a child, she'd spent countless sleepless nights staring at her closet, wondering when the boogeyman would come through, sporting a snarling parody of human features. Each step forward brought the cloud-painted closet door from her childhood directly into her mind. It was cracked open, long, sharp, gnarled claws tapping and scratching through the gap, rending the paint into tatters. Sarah willed the image away. Her father had told her there were no monsters. Society said there were no monsters other than human ones, but they were all wrong. What hid in the hospital, the black thing, was a true monster. A childhood terror realized in destruction and death. Her boots crunched on less and less matter. She was exiting the blast zone from the last pipe bomb. The remaining ambient glow disappeared into the shadows. She took a deep breath and tried to keep her hands from shaking. The blue-white LED light punctured the strengthening darkness, but only for a few meters. Waving her rifle slowly from side to side in vertical diagonals, she did her best to illuminate the path while looking for signs. The only way she was going to live through this was seeing the threat before it was upon her. But even if she saw it, that was no guarantee she'd be fast enough to escape. Silence. Except for the wind and rain battering at the windows, this wing of the hospital might as well have been a tomb. The LED rifle light illuminated shattered walls, the metal remains of furniture and metal litter strewn about the tile floor. She continued walking forward, all too aware she was heading in the direction of another surgery waiting room. Her skin prickled. Sarah stopped and cocked her head to listen. Nothing but the wind and the rain. Goddamn thing probably doesn't even breathe, she thought. Crackle. She went rigid, blood pounding in her ears. She fought to keep her breathing shallow and silent. Sarah waited for the sound to repeat, but it didn't. The cone of light streaming from her rifle was just wide enough to show her another wrecked row of chairs, or at least their remains. The tiled floor reflected the light like a polished mirror. As fast as she dared, she turned in a semicircle, the light reaching for the back walls. The light seemed to disappear at the east wall. Swallowed. The word sent shivers down her spine. That was it. It was there. Right fucking there. She dropped one hand from the rifle, pulled a flare from her belt, took a deep breath, and struck its top. The cylinder flamed into strong red light, and she threw it as far as she could at the east wall. Then she was frozen. The garish crimson glow illuminated a misshapen blob the size of a Mack truck. Tentacles, more than she could count and of all sizes, wriggled from its surface. A crown of eye stalks craned toward her, their dead, insectile orbs quivering with rage. She took a step back, and then another. One of the tentacles crackled and elongated. Several smaller tentacles disappeared back into the blob's body. Another tentacle grew larger, longer, and swished across the floor. The crackling sound continued, crescendoing like fat in a heating fryer. Legs sprouted from the thing's base. Step, step, step. She wanted to run. Christ, but she wanted to turn tail, screaming. Gritting her teeth, she returned her free hand to the rifle. "Boss, you okay?" Perkins' voice chatted in her ear. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She tried again and managed a dusky, "It's here." "Where?" "Surgery waiting room 2. The thing twitched, and then she heard the telltale click of taloned feet on the tile. It was coming. "Get ready!" she yelled, and ran for her life. Her rifle bounced in her hands. The thump of her heart blocked out all sound save for the rapid clicking behind her. The urge to turn, to see just how close it was behind her, was almost too powerful to ignore. She focused instead on the LED lights shining at her from the other waiting room area. She could barely make out the wheelchair silhouette. Something smashed down on the floor beside her with a loud crunch. It was gaining. Its tentacles were too long. It was going to reach her before... The loud crack of a gunshot pierced the air. Another followed, and then another. The rapid muzzle flashes told her Alpha had opened up full auto, but everything seemed so slow, as though the lights and her team was moving further and further away while the creature behind closed the distance. One of the rifles stopped firing, and a new LED light waved her to the left side. Sarah had never run so fast or hard in her life. "Drop!" Perkins shouted. Sarah's body instantly obeyed. She swerved to the left and fell forward into a roll, her knee pads and elbow pads catching the worst of the fall and her helmet clipping the wall's edge. But she slid past the wheelchair and the 2 men with a meter to spare. She flipped over and stared down the hallway. The creature hadn't been as close as her mind told her. It was still at least 10 meters away, but it thrust forward a tentacle nearly that long. The creature stopped its pursuit on short, awkward legs. The trash can wide appendage lashed out and slapped the tile just in front of Givens. He ran to the right. "Do it!" Givens shouted. Perkins hit something on the chair and then flipped the Zippo. A blue flame rose from the seat just near the oxygen tank. Givens opened up with his rifle. Perkins slung over his shoulder as a spare. In the myriad of LED lights and the bare glow created by the spotlights, Sarah saw black liquid dribbling from small perforations. The weapon was hurting it now, and then Perkins ran with the wheelchair beside the tentacle. After 2 meters, he let go of the wheelchair and skidded to a stop. As he turned to run, the tentacle moved side to side and smashed into his shins. The snap of his bones caught her ears in between the sound of Givens' accurate shots. Perkins fell to the ground face first. The tentacle swished across the floor and knocked him into the wall. Givens snapped off several shots at the appendage, clouds of black particles flying into the air, and ran into the hall. Sarah realized what was about to happen. She fell prone, rifle in her hands, and aimed down the hall at the wheelchair still rolling on the tentacle's other side. In her peripheral vision, she watched Givens reach his partner, scoop him up in a single pull, and flip him onto his back in a fireman's carry. Givens started to run. The tentacle tried to trip him, but he managed to sidestep it and slide against the opposite wall. "Move," she said softly. He jumped another swish, his face a mask of pain and effort. Perkins stared blankly up at the ceiling, blood dripping down his forehead. "Move," she said louder. Givens managed another 2 meters. The tentacle clipped the side of his leg, and he stumbled. A rage-filled yell roared from Givens' mouth. Sarah huffed in a deep breath, and then shouted louder than she ever had in her life. "Down!" Just as she'd reacted to Perkins' yell, Givens did the same when he heard her voice. He fell forward and curled himself around his partner. Perkins' broken legs flailed in the air, but she hardly noticed. Givens faced them both to the wall, rifle pointed at the cylinder in the wheelchair. She slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked once. An instant later, the steel-jacketed round pierced the oxygen cylinder's thick shell. The bullet caused a spark. It was gone before the gas started to pour out, but there was plenty of fire for it to combust. The wheelchair had gone directly up against the monster's squat body. The shockwave from the explosion disintegrated much of the creature's outer shell. A nanosecond later, the explosion's fireball fell across exposed liquid. A second shockwave shook Floor 5, sending ceiling tiles flying and clouds of dust into the air. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and fell to her back. With the sprinkler systems offline, there was no water to put out the blaze. She raised her head from the tile, feeling as though she'd been punched in the face. Despite the cold air streaming through the broken waiting room windows, her skin prickled from the heat of the explosions. There was no sign of the creature, but the hallway was still burning. "More? Cancel the fucking strike!" she screamed into her mic. "Lieutenant, are you absolutely certain you've destroyed it?" "Yes, God damn it, cancel the strike!" For what seemed like a million years, there was no response. Givens twitched in the hallway and then slowly unwrapped himself from his partner. Perkins was little more than a breathing rag doll with 2 broken legs, and her fucking head hurt. In a way, a Hellfire missile would be the perfect way to end the evening. "Lieutenant, the strike has been called off. Where is your team?" She exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "West Wing," she panted. "Waiting room 1. "Good. Stay there. Don't move. We're sending medical personnel with a fire team. They should be there shortly." "Are you finally evacuating the building?" "Yes," Moore said. "Other teams will handle that. Right now, you're our top priority." Sarah smiled. "That's the first time I've heard that," she said. "We're going to need a stretcher. One of my men is down with broken limbs. Another has a severe concussion and possibly a fractured skull." "Understood," Moore said. "They will be there as fast as they can." "Good." She lay her head back on the tile. Every muscle, every nerve in her body ached. Even her mind actually hurt. She tapped her mic. Her throat tightened and she realized she was on the verge of tears. She fought off the sensation and reasserted control. There would be time for that later. "Givens? Status." When the Kentuckian finally answered, he sounded as exhausted as she was. "Still breathing, boss. So's Perkins." Through her headset, she heard him clear his throat. Her ears were so battered from the explosions she barely heard anything besides ringing. "Since we're alive, I'm guessing it's gone." "Fucking better be." "Well," he drawled, "if not, tell them to just go ahead and fire that hellfire. I'm fucking tired." Sarah chuckled. "They're coming for us, soldier. Take a nap." "Might just do that," Givens said. She waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. The hours of stress and adrenaline finally caught up with her. There was no threat now. Help was coming. She slowly, reluctantly closed her eyes, and then she passed out. Epilogue. She stood at the window looking out over the concrete runways beyond the high barbed wire fence. The bandages on her face, covering burns and glass cuts, itched. It took a bit of control to keep her hand from ripping them off and going to town with her nails. Maybe she was allergic to the goddamn things. Regardless, she needed to tell the doc next time she saw him, which would no doubt be in a few hours. The thick windows made it impossible to hear them, but she saw several drones flying their runs across obstacle courses. Ellington Field was their training ground, after all. Out there in one of the main hangars, several soldiers sat in front of computers controlling them. At least you fuckers would never have to fight an oil monster, she thought, or go knock down doors in Iraq. Another drone, looking like a strangely shaped bird, rolled down the runway and flew into the air. She grinned despite herself. Maybe she should look into doing that, especially now that the feds had her ass again. She frowned and closed the drapes. Her eyes adjusted to the muted twilight. The room was barely 4 meters wide as well as long. Tiniest hotel room she'd ever stayed in. Or a large cell. Yeah, cell. That was more like it. The door was locked from the outside, and she knew damned well there was a soldier out there guarding it. Whenever they came to get her for debriefing, she saw him standing against the wall, rifle in his hands. She wondered if he ever retired to his bunk or just slept standing up. Her stomach growled. There was no clock in the room, but it felt like lunchtime. Maybe a bit after. She sighed and sat on the twin bed. A twinge of pain stabbed her in the chest. She ground her teeth, but didn't cry out. Her floating rib was cracked, and, as with all rib injuries, they hadn't been able to do jack shit apart from wrapping her torso and giving her drugs. And the drugs weren't narcotic. Apparently the doctors were afraid of aggravating the concussion she'd suffered. Not for the first time, she wondered where Givens, Perkins, and Kilfoyle were. When Moore's team had finally reached them, she was barely awake enough to know she was being placed on a stretcher. At first, she'd thought the creature was back, lifting her with its tentacles toward a black hole filled with sharp teeth. She shivered at the memory. Once she'd realized what was happening, she'd raised her head off the stretcher and seen the team of medical people gathered around Givens and Perkins. Then she'd lost consciousness again. And woke up here. In this place. The unknown building at Ellington Field, surrounded by razor wire. At least one machine gun nest, and a constant sortie of drones overhead. Might as well be Gitmo, except the accommodations and interrogations were far more pleasant. A group of white coats interviewed her every day for 2-hour sessions, followed by a 30-minute break, only to resume again. The only way she knew time existed was by stealing glances at the watches the white coats wore. She didn't know their names. No one in the place seemed to carry a badge. This was a black site, or something resembling one. Maybe this is where the CIA illegally held domestically captured criminals. Boy, the FBI is going to be pissed if that's the case. But the whitecoats weren't CIA. They were scientists. At least they talked like eggheads. They asked questions about how the creature reacted to different stimuli. What did it do when faced with fire? What happened to it during the shockwaves? How had it eaten O'Malley? How did Schneck die? How had she stopped the creature at the nursery? How did it react to water? How did it damage the building? What didn't it eat? What did it eat? What did it... Question after question. The only indications she had of the days were the periods of sleep after a meal and the occasional sign of the sun before it disappeared beneath the horizon. Their voices rattled in her dreams. At least the ones where she wasn't forever running down a darkened hallway while something behind her slowly cut pieces of flesh from her retreating body. And they didn't understand when she didn't want to answer a question. All she'd been told about her men was that they were fine and she would see them soon. Somehow she doubted that. A knock broke her reminiscence, and she stared at the heavy steel door. After loosing a sigh, she said, "Come in." Something beeped on the other side of the door, followed by the sound of the lock sliding back. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges. The ambient sound of people talking in low voices flooded into her cell, and then a white-coated woman walked into the room. "Lieutenant," a familiar voice said, "may I have a moment?" Sarah blinked at her. Dr. Moore? The woman smiled. Yes, Lieutenant. That's me. About time, Sarah said. The woman raised an eyebrow. I'd like to talk if you're in the mood. Sure. I'm not doing anything else at the moment besides staring at the wall. Moore pulled a metal chair into the room, put it near the bed, and then the door closed behind her. May I? Sarah didn't answer, but nodded. Thank you, Moore said. She moved to the chair and sat down. You didn't bring your friends with you? Friends? Moore asked. The 3 jerks I've been talking to for God knows how long. No, Moore said. I think they've asked enough questions for now, don't you? Sarah grunted. You have no idea. Of course I do, Moore said. I'm the one that helped come up with the list of things to ask. And I've seen the tapes, of course. Of course you have, Sarah thought. The interrogation room had had cameras in each of its 4 corners, and all of them had been pointed at her. So you have something to ask you didn't want them to know about? She gestured to the camera in the corner of her room. I'm sure that thing gets hi-fi and HD. Moore smiled. It does. And better quality than HD. And yes, they are watching and listening to this conversation. I want you to speak freely and candidly, but mostly I want you to listen. Afterwards, of course, I'll answer some questions. You're going to answer questions? Moore nodded. Anything I want to know? Everything I can tell you. Everything I can tell you, she thought. That wasn't the same thing as saying everything I know. Sarah opened her mouth to fire off a barrage of questions and then stopped. For days, weeks, who knew how long she'd been formulating the list of everything she wanted to know. And now that she could get answers, the questions were nowhere to be found. Moore's grin widened. Why don't I start by telling you a few things? Your men are battered, but okay. Mr. Givens is convalescing nicely. He has many of the same injuries as you, along with some burns on his back. I guess he was too close to the entity when you blew up the oxygen tank. Could have been a lot worse, Sarah said. Too right. Moore folded her hands in her lap. Kilfoyle's subdural hematoma was handled surgically, and he's expected to make a full recovery, and Bradfish's ankle should heal fine. Ep is a bit of a different story. He's going to require several surgeries to repair the burn damage to his hands, and he may still lose them. But we're hopeful, and I assure you he's receiving the best care on the planet. What about Perkins? He's had a surgery to repair one of the shattered shins. The other will be fine, but he'll need more medical care before he's ready to stand up and walk on his own. Sarah licked her lips. Is he going to be able to rejoin the SWAT team? Unknown, Moore said. We'll have to see how he progresses. If they managed to put him back together again, I'm sure he'll work hard in rehab to make that happen. He will, Sarah said. And that begs the question. Confused, Sarah said. Begs what question? Your career in SWAT, Moore said, her expression flat and serious. Sarah's skin prickled. Here was where the penny dropped. They were going to tell her she was never leaving this place, or that they were relocating her or reactivating her for military service. Whatever it was. It wasn't going to... Lieutenant? Yes? Moore sighed. You look very concerned. So hear me out, okay? Calmly? Fists clenched, Sarah managed to nod. Good. I think you understand we have a serious national security issue here. You mean that there are goddamned oil monsters on this planet? Moore nodded. We can't have the public knowing about this. There would be worldwide panic. You understand that, don't you? Over the past several days, Sarah had come to the same conclusion, which is why she half expected their soldier guarding her room to open the door and put a round in her head. A little difficult not to, she said. Moore's smile returned. Good. That said, do you agree that you and your men will have to sign non-disclosure agreements? Givens, Perkins, and I are still in the reserves. We already have one in place with our security clearances. Yes, Moore said. You do. I'm talking about the rest of the team. I think they'll understand that. Moore nodded again. She looked pleased. I may be a Fed, Lieutenant, or spook, or whatever they call us these days, but I truly do not want to have to make this an order or threaten you and your men. As far as I'm concerned, I trust your team to keep their mouths shut and go back to their lives. Sarah cocked her head slightly. I feel like there's a but coming. But, Moore said, we'd like to offer you something instead. Which is, we'd like your team to join ours. Sarah blinked. What team would that be? Moore gestured to encompass the building. This team. This project. I want you to train our assets based on your experiences with the creature. I want you to suggest arms and weapons capable of dealing with it should we come across another of its kind. She shivered. Another one? That thought scared her more than she wanted to admit. And then it hit her. You haven't told me about the hospital. No, Moore said. I haven't. How many survived? Moore shrugged. Doesn't matter. Your team saved 2 nurseries. You managed to protect an entire floor of people from meeting that thing on floor 5. You saved as many of your men as you could. And most importantly, you kept the entity from leaving the building. I don't think I like this, Sarah said. This facility, whatever the hell it is, looks like a lab. It is, Moore said. Sarah narrowed her eyes. And if it's a lab, it means you probably have one of those fucking things in here. A pause hung in the air. With each passing second, another wave of fury roiled from her gut. She wanted to reach across the space between them and snap this grinning woman's neck like a wishbone. And if that's not bad enough, you want me to guard it. Moore's smile faded again. The woman's eyes were as cheerful as ever, and her cheeks were slack, but the tension in the room spiked. Lieutenant, I'm going to be frank. We captured an entity at the HAL lab where the creature first arrived. We captured another entity in the bio-waste tank at Ben Taub. Fuck me, Cillian said. You have 2 of those things? Correct. And you haven't torched them? What the hell is wrong with you? Please lower your voice, Moore said. There's no need to yell. Sarah stood from the bed and winced as a lightning bolt of pain shot through her chest. She clutched at the broken rib despite herself. You aren't stupid, she said in a low voice. You know how dangerous those things are and what they're capable of. We do. Like I said, Sarah said with a laugh. You're not stupid. The laughter died in her throat and the mock smile turned into a savage sneer. You're just insane. Moore slowly stood from her chair. She was shorter than Sarah, but the woman wore heels and met her eye to eye. Their noses nearly touched. No, Lieutenant. I'm scared as hell, and so should you be. Now, will you please sit down so we can finish this? Sarah was good at reading people, and she didn't think Moore was lying about being scared. The insanity part? She still wasn't sure on that front. Might as well hear it all, she whispered. She held the stare for a moment and then slowly sat back on the bed. Moore sat in the chair and once again folded her hands together. We recovered several scientists from HAL. They have a wealth of information regarding the creature, and we've asked them to join our team. They have. They will lead the creature's study so we can properly exterminate their kind if we find any more in the wild. And considering how much oil is being brought up from the deep-sea trenches these days, don't you think that's a wise thing to do? Is that where it came from? Yes. A barrel of oil was sent here from a trench near Papua New Guinea. The creature was the oil. Christ, she said. What happened to the rig? Moore waved her hand. It doesn't matter right now. If you agree to join us, then you can know the whole story. See every tape and talk to the other survivors. I think you'll find them very helpful. After all, they also managed to kill an entity. Wish they'd kill the other one, too, Sarah said. Regardless, there are 2 entities in this building, and I need help in studying them and preparing to exterminate them should we inadvertently bring up another. And what does that pay? Moore smiled. More than you'd make if you worked 50 years being a cop. At least there's that, Sarah said. Is that everything? The whole pitch, everything? Yes. Now, Moore said as she stood, I can sit here and say that I need you until I'm blue in the face, or threaten you, or torture you, or do whatever you're afraid I'm going to do. But I think you've faced enough adversity just lately. I'd like you to think about it. You'll have dinner with Mr. Givens later this evening if you like. Sarah couldn't help but grin. Yes, please. I thought so. Moore said and walked to the door. The lock clicked and she opened the door with ease. You have time to give me an answer. Perhaps you'll confer with Givens before you make a decision. In any case, it was a pleasure to finally meet you, Lieutenant. You and your team did a hell of a job. Thank you. And what if we hadn't? Moore dropped her eyes to the floor and thought for a moment. She finally raised her head, her face completely expressionless. I like the city of Houston, she said. I'd hate to have seen it nuked. With that, she walked through the doorway and into the hall. The door closed behind her. Sarah lay on the bed and closed her eyes. The ache of her broken rib was annoying, but not too painful. She didn't want to take another pill if she was going to see Givens later. She'd no doubt that he would take the deal if she did. She knew Perkins would, too. The others? They might or might not. But she'd try to convince them. The alternative? Regardless what Moore said, they'd probably end up with bullets to the backs of their skulls if they turned her down. That was going to be a tricky sell. She hoped it wasn't true. But Moore was strange. Hard to read on some things, all too easy on others. That meant she couldn't be trusted. Not one bit. The deal would have to be on paper, and maybe once they saw it, they'd all be able to make a properly informed decision. The carrot of money was one thing. The stick? She didn't really want to know. Making the deal was their only way out. Maybe she shouldn't trust Moore about anything else, but she definitely trusted the woman's intention to use her team to make weapons, to train, and to guard. So as long as they needed one another, she could make this work. And if Moore decided they were expendable after that, she'd make sure the woman ended up with a bullet in her skull. Half asleep, she grinned in the semi-darkness.